April 26th, 1986. It started like any other night. The city of Pripyat was calm. Lights were glowing softly in apartment windows. Families were sleeping. Children were dreaming. Nothing felt unusual. Nothing felt wrong. Just a few kilometers away, a massive nuclear power plant stood in the darkness. Silent, powerful, unforgiving. Inside reactor number 4, a group of engineers was preparing for a test. It was supposed to be simple, a safety test. The goal was to find out if the reactor could still cool itself during a power outage. But there was a problem. To perform this test, they had to disable several critical safety systems. And they did. One by one, the protections were turned off. The reactor was no longer fully under control. But the operators believed they understood the risks. They believed they could manage it. They were wrong. The power level inside the reactor began to drop too low. This was not part of the plan. To fix it, the operators made a dangerous decision. They pulled out too many control rods. This increased the reactivity of the core. Now the reactor was unstable, very unstable. But the test continued. Minutes passed. Everything seemed quiet, almost too quiet. Then suddenly the power began to surge, fast, uncontrollably fast. The operators realized something was wrong, but by then it was already too late. At 1:23 a.m., they pressed the emergency shutdown button, a button designed to stop the reaction instantly. But instead, it made everything worse. The reactor spiked to extreme power levels. Fuel rods overheated. Water instantly turned into steam. Pressure built up inside the reactor core. There was no stopping it now. And then, an explosion. A massive blast tore through the reactor building. The 1,000-ton concrete lid was lifted into the air like it was nothing. The core was exposed to the open sky. Burning graphite was thrown across the roof. Fires started everywhere, and with them, radiation. Invisible, odorless, silent, but deadly beyond imagination. No one in the city knew what had just happened. There were no alarms in Pripyat, no warnings. People were still sleeping peacefully, completely unaware that radioactive particles were already spreading through the air. The wind carried them across the city, into homes, onto streets, into the lungs of thousands of people. Within minutes, the disaster was no longer contained. It was moving, spreading, expanding. Firefighters were the first to respond. They arrived within minutes. No special equipment, no understanding of the danger. They saw a fire, and they did what they were trained to do. They fought it. They climbed onto the roof. They stepped directly onto radioactive debris. They touched burning fragments of the reactor, not knowing that every second was poisoning them. Their skin began to burn. Their bodies absorbed lethal doses of radiation. But they kept working, because no one told them the truth. Inside the control room, confusion turned into panic. The operators could not understand what had happened. The reactor was not supposed to explode. It was considered impossible. And yet, it had. Outside, a strange glow filled the night sky. A deep blue light. Unnatural. Almost beautiful. People woke up and looked out of their windows. Some even walked outside to watch. They stood on bridges. They watched the fire. They watched the glowing reactor. They didn't know. They were watching something deadly. Children played outside. Couples stood together. Neighbors talked quietly in the night. All under a cloud of invisible radiation. Hours passed. The fires continued to burn. Radiation levels kept rising. But still, no official warning was given to the city. Life continued, as if nothing had happened. But inside the plant, the situation was out of control. The core was still burning, releasing massive amounts of radioactive material into the atmosphere. This was no longer just an accident, it was a disaster. And it was only beginning. The explosion was only the beginning. Inside the power plant, the situation was getting worse by the minute. The reactor core was completely destroyed. But no one fully understood it yet. Radiation levels inside the building were rising rapidly. Meters were showing extreme readings. But there was a problem. Most of the measuring devices had limits. They could not display the real radiation levels. So when the operators looked at the numbers, they believed the situation was under control. They were wrong. The actual radiation levels were thousands of times higher, lethal within minutes. Some workers were already feeling it, a strange metallic taste in their mouths, dizziness, weakness. But they ignored it. They thought it was stress. They thought it would pass. It didn't. Firefighters continued to battle the flames. They had no protective suits, no proper masks, nothing to shield them from radiation. They were exposed completely. One of the firefighters picked up a piece of graphite from the ground. It was glowing slightly. He didn't know what it was. Moments later, his hand began to burn, not from heat, but from radiation. Another firefighter climbed onto the roof. From there, he could see directly into the reactor, a hole where the core used to be, burning, smoking, glowing with an unnatural light. He would later describe it as something he had never seen before. Something that did not belong to this world. Meanwhile, inside the control room, panic was spreading. The operators tried to pump water into the reactor, but the system was no longer functioning properly. Pipes were damaged, valves were broken, nothing worked the way it should. Still, they kept trying, because they didn't have another option. They didn't realize there was nothing left to save. Outside the plant, more emergency crews arrived, ambulances, police, additional firefighters. None of them were told the truth. They were told it was just a fire, a normal industrial accident, nothing more. And so they walked directly into danger. By early morning, the first victims were already collapsing. Firefighters began vomiting. Some could not stand, others lost consciousness. Their skin turned red, as if they had severe burns. But there was no fire touching them. This was something else, something invisible. They were taken to the hospital in Pripyat. Doctors and nurses rushed to help, but they had no idea what they were dealing with. There were no warnings, no instructions. The patients were treated like burn victims. Clothes were removed, skin was examined, but every second the radiation continued to spread, not just inside their bodies, but onto everyone around them. The hospital itself was becoming contaminated. Doctors were exposed, nurses were exposed, other patients were exposed. And still, no one understood the scale of the disaster. Back at the power plant, the fire was still burning. The graphite inside the reactor continued to burn intensely, releasing radioactive smoke into the atmosphere. This smoke was carried by the wind, far beyond the borders of the Soviet Union. But at that moment, no one outside knew anything. Inside the Soviet system, information was tightly controlled. Admitting a nuclear disaster was unthinkable. So the truth was delayed, hidden, ignored. Officials were informed, but decisions were slow. Very slow. They needed confirmation. They needed reports. They needed time. Time they did not have. In Pripyat, the morning arrived. The sun rose over the city, and everything looked normal. People woke up, they went to work, children went outside to play, buses were running, shops were open, life continued. But something was different. A strange smell in the air, a metallic taste. Some people noticed it. Most ignored it. They had no reason to be afraid. No one told them they should be. On a nearby bridge, people gathered to watch the fire. It was glowing in the distance. Beautiful in a strange way, blue light rising into the sky. They stood there for hours, watching, talking, not knowing that this place would later be called the Bridge of Death. By midday, radiation levels in the city were dangerously high, but still, no evacuation order was given. Officials feared panic. They feared chaos. So they waited, and while they waited, people continued to be exposed. Children played in contaminated sand. Families opened windows, letting radioactive dust inside. People walked through invisible particles falling from the sky. It was everywhere. On clothes, on skin, in the air they breathed. Back at the hospital, the condition of the firefighters worsened rapidly. Their symptoms became more severe. Uncontrollable vomiting, severe pain. Their skin began to blister, as if it was burning from the inside. Doctors were confused. Nothing made sense. They had never seen anything like this before. Some patients asked what was happening, but no one had answers, only silence. By the afternoon, it was clear that this was not a normal accident. But even then, the full truth was still not revealed. The city continued to live its final normal hours, completely unaware that everything was about to change forever. By the afternoon of April 26th, the truth could no longer be ignored. Radiation levels were rising, not just inside the power plant, but across the entire city. Yet still, no public announcement was made. No warnings, no evacuation. Inside government offices, officials were beginning to understand the scale of the disaster. But admitting it was another matter. This was the Soviet Union. Information was controlled. Fear of panic was stronger than the need for truth. So they hesitated, they delayed, they argued, while an entire city remained exposed. Military units were sent to the area. Radiation specialists began taking measurements. What they found was terrifying. Levels far beyond anything considered safe. Even standing outside for a short time was dangerous. But still, Pripyat continued to function like a normal city. Children laughed in the streets. People walked to the store. Some even went fishing near the cooling channels of the power plant. They had no idea that every minute increased the damage to their bodies. By the evening, hospitals were overwhelmed. More and more people were arriving with symptoms, headaches, nausea, extreme fatigue. Some collapsed in the streets. Others could no longer stand. Doctors were running out of explanations. And still, no official information was released. Finally, late at night, a decision was made. The city would be evacuated. But not immediately. The plan was to wait until the next day, to prepare transportation, to avoid panic. And so, once again, time was lost. On the morning of April 27th, buses began arriving in Pripyat. Hundreds of them, quietly, without explanation. People watched from their windows, confused, concerned. Rumors began to spread. Something was wrong. But no one knew exactly what. Then an announcement came over the loudspeakers. Residents were told to prepare for a temporary evacuation. They were told to take only essential items, documents, some food, a few personal belongings. They were told they would return in a few days. Most believed it. They left their homes as they were. Dishes still on the table, toys on the floor, pets left behind, everything frozen in time. Buses filled quickly. Families sat together in silence. No one truly understood what was happening. Some people looked back at their buildings, at their balconies, at their lives, not knowing they would never see them again. The evacuation was completed within a few hours. Nearly 50,000 people were removed from the city. Pripyat became a ghost town, empty, silent, abandoned. But the danger was far from over. Back at the reactor, the situation was still critical. The fire continued to burn. Radiation continued to pour into the atmosphere. And now a new threat emerged. Beneath the reactor, there were large pools of water. If the molten core reached them, it could trigger a massive steam explosion. An explosion powerful enough to destroy the remaining reactors and spread radioactive material across a much larger area, possibly making large parts of Europe uninhabitable. This could not be allowed to happen. Something had to be done. But what? No one had ever faced a situation like this before. There were no instructions, no clear solutions, only risk, extreme risk. A group of volunteers was chosen. They were given a nearly impossible task: to enter the flooded areas beneath the reactor, in complete darkness, surrounded by radiation, to open valves and drain the water. They knew the danger, they knew the risk, but they went anyway. Because if they didn't, the consequences could be catastrophic. Wearing minimal protection, they entered the water, step by step, feeling their way through the darkness, searching for the valves. Time was running out. Every second mattered. Finally, they found them, and they opened them. Water began to drain. The immediate threat was reduced, but the danger was still far from over. Above them, the reactor continued to burn. Helicopters were brought in. Pilots were ordered to fly directly over the open reactor, to drop sand, boron, lead, anything that could help contain the radiation. Each flight exposed them to intense radiation, but they continued, again and again, flying into the invisible danger. Some of them would later suffer severe consequences. But at that moment, there was no other choice. The disaster was growing. But so was the effort to stop it. Thousands of people were being brought in. Soldiers, engineers, workers. They would later be known as the Liquidators. Their mission was simple: contain the disaster, at any cost. They cleaned radioactive debris. They buried contaminated soil. They worked on the roof of the reactor, where radiation levels were so high that even machines failed. Humans had to do the job, running out for seconds at a time, shoveling pieces of the reactor, then running back again and again. Every second counted. Every second was dangerous. But they did it because someone had to, because there was no alternative, because the disaster had to be stopped, no matter the cost. While thousands of people were risking their lives to contain the disaster, far away in Moscow, a different kind of battle was unfolding. A battle of information, a battle of control. At first, the reports coming in from Chernobyl were confusing, incomplete, contradictory. Some officials believed it was a serious accident. Others thought it was being exaggerated. But one thing was clear: if the truth got out, the consequences would be enormous. The Soviet Union had always presented itself as strong, stable, advanced. A nuclear disaster of this scale would damage that image. So instead of immediate transparency, there was hesitation, silence, delay. Meetings were held behind closed doors. High-ranking officials discussed what to do, how much to reveal, how much to hide. Time passed. Hours turned into days. And still, no official announcement was made to the outside world. Inside the Soviet Union, information was limited, carefully controlled. But outside, something strange was happening. On April 28th, nearly 2 days after the explosion, workers at a nuclear power plant in Sweden made a discovery. Their radiation alarms went off. At first, they thought there was a leak inside their own facility. Emergency protocols were activated. Workers were checked for contamination. But nothing inside the plant explained the readings. The radiation was coming from outside, from the air. This was unexpected. This was alarming. Scientists began investigating. They analyzed wind patterns, air samples, radiation levels, and slowly, a disturbing conclusion formed. The source of the radiation was not in Sweden. It was coming from far away, from the Soviet Union, but there had been no announcement, no warning, no report of any accident. So Sweden demanded answers. They contacted Soviet authorities, asking a direct question. Had there been a nuclear incident? At first, there was no clear response, but the evidence was undeniable. Radiation was spreading across Europe. It could not be hidden anymore. Finally, under international pressure, the Soviet Union made a brief announcement. There had been an accident. That was all. No details. No explanation of the scale. No warning of the true danger. But by then, it was already too late. Radioactive clouds had traveled across multiple countries: Belarus, Ukraine, Russia, Poland, Sweden, Finland, and beyond. People had already been exposed, without knowing, without protection, without choice. Back near Chernobyl, the situation remained critical. Efforts to contain the reactor continued day and night, but the core was still unstable, still releasing radiation. Scientists began to consider extreme solutions. One of the biggest concerns was the molten core, a mixture of nuclear fuel, metal, and concrete, burning its way downward. If it reached groundwater, it could contaminate water supplies for millions of people. Or worse, trigger another explosion. To prevent this, a new operation began. Miners were brought in, hundreds of them. Their task was to dig a tunnel beneath the reactor to create space for a cooling system or even a barrier, something to stop the core from spreading further. They worked in extreme conditions, high temperatures, limited ventilation, radiation exposure. Many worked without proper protection. Some even removed their clothing due to the heat. Still, they continued, day after day, digging, sweating, breathing in contaminated air because they knew what was at stake. Above ground, helicopters continued their missions, dropping materials into the reactor, trying to smother the fire, trying to reduce radiation, but it was not easy. The heat rising from the reactor affected the aircraft. Some pilots struggled to maintain control. One helicopter crashed, falling dangerously close to the reactor, a reminder of how dangerous every second was. Meanwhile, scientists raced to understand what had gone wrong. How a reactor designed with safety systems could explode so violently. Investigations began, data was collected, interviews were conducted. Slowly, the truth started to emerge. It was not just human error, it was also design flaws. A dangerous combination. A reactor that could become unstable under certain conditions, and operators who were not fully aware of the risks. Together, they created a perfect disaster, a chain reaction of mistakes and flaws, leading to one of the worst nuclear accidents in history. But even now, the full impact was still unknown, because the real consequences would take years to unfold. As the world slowly began to understand what had happened, the people who were closest to the explosion were already paying the price. The firefighters who arrived that night had received the highest doses of radiation. At first, it didn't seem deadly. They were conscious. They could speak. Some even believed they would recover. But within hours, their condition began to change. Severe nausea, uncontrollable vomiting, dizziness, weakness. Their bodies were reacting to something they could not see, something they did not understand. They were transported to a hospital in Moscow, specialized, better equipped. Doctors there had more experience with radiation exposure, but even for them, this situation was extreme. The patients were isolated, placed in special rooms. Their clothes were removed and destroyed because they were highly contaminated. Even touching them was dangerous. But the worst was yet to come. Radiation does not just burn the outside of the body. It destroys from within. It damages cells, breaks down tissues, destroys the body's ability to heal. Over the next few days, their condition worsened rapidly. Their skin began to blister, peeling away, as if burned from the inside, their mouths filled with sores, making it painful to speak, painful to swallow. Their organs began to fail. One by one, the body was shutting down. Not from visible injuries, but from invisible damage. Some of them were young, strong, healthy just days before. Now they could barely move. Families were allowed to visit, but only briefly, and often without full understanding of the danger. They were told not to touch, but some did anyway, holding hands, saying goodbye, not knowing that even that contact carried risk. One of the wives later said that she did not recognize her husband. His face had changed, swollen, discolored. His body was no longer the same. And yet, he was still there, still aware, still suffering. Doctors did everything they could. Blood transfusions, experimental treatments, constant monitoring. But the damage was too severe. Radiation had destroyed their bone marrow, the part of the body that produces blood cells. Without it, the body cannot survive. Infections spread easily. Bleeding could not be controlled. Healing became impossible. One by one, the firefighters began to die. Days after the explosion. Not instantly, but slowly, painfully. Meanwhile, back in the evacuated city, homes remained untouched, windows open, curtains moving in the wind, toys left where children had dropped them, food still on tables, everything frozen in time, but covered in invisible contamination. Animals roamed the streets, pets that had been left behind, waiting for owners who would never return. Some would starve, others would become wild. The area was no longer safe for any living thing. Soldiers were sent in, given orders to eliminate animals, to prevent the spread of contamination. It was another harsh reality of the disaster. Not just people, but entire ecosystems were affected. In the surrounding regions, more people began to show symptoms, but many cases were not immediately connected to radiation. Headaches, fatigue, illness. It was difficult to trace, difficult to prove, and in many cases, the truth was still being hidden. Official reports were limited, carefully written, minimizing the scale of the disaster. But reality was different. Reality was far worse. Children were among the most vulnerable. Their bodies absorbed radiation more easily, especially through contaminated milk. In the months and years that followed, cases of thyroid cancer increased significantly. Families were affected, entire communities changed, lives were altered forever. But at that moment, many still did not know the full extent of what had happened. Because radiation is not immediate. It is slow, silent. It does not always show itself right away, but when it does, it leaves permanent damage. And sometimes, there is no way back. As the immediate crisis slowly came under control, a new reality began to take shape. The area around Chernobyl was no longer safe. Not for days, not for months, but for years, possibly decades. A decision was made to create a restricted zone, an area where human life would no longer be allowed. This became known as the exclusion zone, a vast territory surrounding the power plant, dozens of villages, forests, fields, entire communities, all abandoned. People were not allowed to return, not even to collect their belongings. Everything they had built, everything they owned, was left behind. The land itself was contaminated. Radioactive particles had settled into the soil, into the water, into the trees. It could not simply be cleaned. It had to be isolated, controlled, watched. Meanwhile, the reactor remained a threat. Even after the fire was reduced, the core was still unstable, still dangerous. It had to be contained. And quickly, engineers began working on a massive structure, a protective shell built directly over the destroyed reactor. Its purpose was simple: to trap the radiation inside, to prevent further release into the environment. This structure would later be known as the sarcophagus. Construction began under extreme conditions: high radiation levels, limited time, constant risk. Workers could only remain in certain areas for minutes at a time. Every second mattered. Every exposure added to the risk. But the work continued, day and night. Thousands of workers were involved, many of them young, many of them unaware of the long-term consequences. They built walls, they poured concrete, they assembled steel structures, piece by piece, creating a barrier between the reactor and the outside world. The sarcophagus was completed in just a few months. A massive achievement, but not a perfect solution. It was built quickly, under pressure, and over time, it began to weaken. Cracks formed, leaks appeared. The danger was reduced, but not eliminated. Beyond the reactor, the environment continued to change. Forests near the plant turned reddish-brown. Trees died rapidly. This area became known as the Red Forest, one of the most contaminated places on Earth. Animals in the region were affected. Some died quickly, others adapted. Over time, wildlife began to return, but the environment was not the same. Radiation remained, invisible, present, constant. In the years that followed, scientists studied the area, trying to understand the long-term effects, how radiation spreads, how it affects living organisms, how ecosystems respond. What they found was complex. Not everything died. Some life continued, but often changed, deformed, altered. The human impact was even more profound. Thousands of people were displaced, forced to leave their homes, their memories, their lives. Many struggled to adapt to new environments, new cities, new realities. Psychological effects were severe: loss, fear, uncertainty, a feeling that something invisible had taken everything away. Governments continued to manage the situation, monitoring radiation levels, restricting access, maintaining control over the zone. But the legacy of the disaster remained, not just in the land, but in people, in stories, in memories. Even decades later, the name Chernobyl carries weight. It represents more than a place, more than an accident. It represents a warning, a reminder of how powerful technology can be and how dangerous it becomes when control is lost. But even now, there are parts of the story still unfolding, because the effects of that night did not end in 1986. They continue to this day. Even after the reactor was covered, the danger did not disappear. For thousands of people, the work was only beginning. They were called the liquidators, men and women from across the Soviet Union. Soldiers, engineers, drivers, workers, ordinary people, sent to deal with an extraordinary disaster. Many of them did not fully understand what they were facing. They were given simple instructions: follow orders, complete the task, return. But it was never that simple. Their work was everywhere. On the roofs of buildings, in the forests, in abandoned villages. They cleaned radioactive debris, buried contaminated soil, washed streets, removed anything that could carry radiation. Each task seemed small, but together they formed a massive effort. One of the most dangerous jobs was on the roof of the reactor building. After the explosion, pieces of highly radioactive material had been scattered across the surface. Machines were sent first, robots designed to handle dangerous environments, but they failed. Radiation levels were too high. Electronics stopped working. The machines became useless, so humans had to take their place. They were given protective suits, but the protection was limited. They were told to run out onto the roof, shovel debris, and return as quickly as possible. Each person had only seconds, sometimes less than a minute. Longer exposure meant serious damage, or worse. They ran, grabbed pieces of graphite, shoveled fragments of the reactor, then ran back, heart racing, breathing fast, knowing that every second mattered. Some called it a race against death. Others didn't speak about it at all because there were no words. Day after day, this work continued. Hundreds of people rotated through the same task, each taking on the risk, each doing their part. Elsewhere, entire villages were buried, houses destroyed, buildings demolished, soil removed. Everything contaminated was either cleaned or hidden beneath layers of earth. In forests, workers cut down trees, cleared large areas, trying to reduce the spread of radioactive particles. The work was exhausting, physically, mentally, emotionally. Some workers began to feel the effects: fatigue, headaches, nausea. Others showed no immediate symptoms, but the damage was already happening. Slowly, silently, many were told they would be fine, that the exposure was within safe limits, that everything was under control. But in reality, those limits were often exceeded. Records were incomplete. Information was not always accurate. And for many liquidators, the long-term consequences would come years later. Health problems, chronic illness, increased risk of cancer. Some would never fully recover, but at the time, they continued. Because the work had to be done, because there was no alternative, because leaving it unfinished was not an option. Back in the exclusion zone, the environment remained unpredictable. Some areas were heavily contaminated. Others appeared almost normal. Radiation did not spread evenly. It formed invisible patterns, hotspots, areas of extreme danger, next to places that seemed safe. This made the work even more difficult, even more dangerous. One wrong step could mean exposure. One wrong decision could have lasting consequences. Despite everything, life slowly began to return. Not human life, but wildlife. Animals moved into the abandoned areas. With no people around, nature started to reclaim the land. Wolves, deer, birds. They adapted. They survived. But they were living in a changed world. A world shaped by radiation. Some showed signs of mutation. Others appeared unaffected. The full impact was still being studied, still not fully understood. Meanwhile, the zone remained restricted, guarded, controlled. Entry was limited. Only authorized personnel were allowed inside. The outside world continued to watch, to study, to learn. Chernobyl became a symbol, a case study, a warning. But for those who had been there, it was something more. It was personal. It was real. It was something they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. As time passed, the disaster at Chernobyl was no longer just a local event. It had become a global concern. Across Europe, scientists were monitoring radiation levels. Unusual readings were being detected in multiple countries. Rain carried radioactive particles into the soil, onto crops, into water sources. Farmers in affected regions were told not to use their harvest. Milk was contaminated. Vegetables were unsafe. Entire food supplies had to be destroyed, but not everywhere. In some places, the warnings came too late. People had already consumed contaminated food without knowing, without protection. Governments began issuing guidelines. Stay indoors, avoid certain foods, limit exposure, but information varied. Some countries reacted quickly, others were slower. Confusion spread alongside radiation. For many people, this was the first time they realized that a disaster in one place could affect the entire world. Back in the Soviet Union, the situation remained complex. Efforts to contain the reactor continued. Monitoring increased. New safety measures were introduced, but trust had been damaged. People began to question official statements, to doubt what they were being told, because the truth had been delayed. and that delay had consequences. In the years that followed, the full impact of Chernobyl began to emerge. Not immediately, but gradually. Cases of cancer increased, especially thyroid cancer in children. This became one of the most documented effects. Thousands of cases were linked to radiation exposure. Medical systems struggled to respond, resources were limited, information was still incomplete. Researchers worked to understand the long-term effects, how radiation affects the human body over time, how it changes DNA, how it increases the risk of disease. Some effects were clear, others remained uncertain, debated, studied. Even today, not all questions have been fully answered. For those who had been evacuated, life never truly returned to normal. Many were relocated to new cities, new homes, but the sense of loss remained. They had left everything behind, their past, their memories, their identity. Some tried to return, even illegally. Elderly residents who missed their homes, their land, their way of life. They chose to live in contaminated areas, accepting the risk because for them, leaving was worse. Psychological effects became another major consequence. Anxiety, fear, stigma. People associated with Chernobyl were often treated differently, as if they carried something dangerous, even when they didn't. The disaster had created not just physical damage, but social and emotional scars. Meanwhile, the nuclear industry around the world began to change. Safety protocols were reviewed, reactor designs were modified, new regulations were introduced. Chernobyl became a turning point, a moment that forced the world to reconsider nuclear safety, to understand that even advanced systems can fail, and when they do, the consequences can be catastrophic. Back in the exclusion zone, time continued to pass. Buildings decayed, nature grew over roads, trees broke through concrete. The city of Pripyat slowly disappeared into silence. But it was not completely empty. Scientists continued to study the area, monitoring radiation, observing wildlife, collecting data, trying to learn from what had happened, because understanding the disaster was the only way to prevent another one. And yet, despite everything that had been learned, the question remained. Could something like this happen again? The answer was not as simple as people hoped. Years passed after the disaster, but for many people, time did not move forward in the same way. For them, everything was divided into two parts, before Chernobyl and after. For the workers who survived, life became a constant reminder of what they had experienced. Many of them returned home with no visible injuries. At first, everything seemed normal, but slowly, changes began to appear. Fatigue that would not go away. Weakness. Frequent illness. Doctors struggled to explain everything. Some conditions were linked to radiation, others were harder to prove, because radiation does not always leave clear evidence. It works quietly, over time, inside the body. Some liquidators developed serious health problems years after their exposure, diseases that appeared without warning, conditions that worsened quickly. For many, the connection to Chernobyl was undeniable, but proving it was not always easy. Records were incomplete. Exposure levels were not always accurately measured. And in some cases, they were never recorded at all. This created uncertainty, frustration, a feeling that the truth was still out of reach. Families were affected too. Not just those who had been exposed directly, but their children. Some were born with health issues. Others grew up under constant medical observation, regular checkups, tests, monitoring, because no one knew exactly what to expect. Radiation had changed something, but the full picture was still unclear. In affected regions, entire communities lived with this uncertainty. Every illness raised questions. Was it related? Was it not? There were no simple answers. Meanwhile, the exclusion zone remained closed, but not completely empty. Over time, certain groups were allowed limited access. Scientists, researchers, workers maintaining the site. They entered carefully, with protective equipment, with strict rules, measuring radiation, avoiding high-risk areas. Still, even with precautions, the danger was never zero. Radiation remained in the soil, in buildings, in objects left behind. A simple item, a piece of metal, a patch of ground, could still carry risk. In some places, levels had decreased. Natural processes had reduced contamination, rain, wind, time. But in other areas, the danger remained high, uneven, unpredictable. This made the zone unique, a place where danger could not always be seen or easily measured. And yet, despite the risks, people became curious. Stories about Chernobyl spread around the world. Images of abandoned buildings, empty streets, Ferris wheels that never moved again, a frozen city left behind. This created a strange kind of attraction, a mix of fear and curiosity. Some people began entering the zone illegally, known as stalkers. They avoided checkpoints, traveled through forests, explored abandoned buildings, spent nights inside the exclusion zone. For them, it was an adventure, a challenge, a way to experience something forbidden. But it was also dangerous, not just because of radiation, but because of collapsing structures, wild animals, unpredictable conditions. Some were caught, others managed to return without being detected. But each trip carried risk. Over time, official tours were introduced, controlled visits, guided groups, strict routes. Visitors could see Pripyat, the abandoned school, the hospital, the amusement park, all preserved in time. But even these tours followed rules. No touching objects, no sitting on the ground, no taking items, because contamination was still present. Even decades later, standing in Pripyat felt like stepping into the past. Classrooms with books still on desks, apartments with personal belongings untouched, photographs left behind, everything exactly as it was. A city frozen in a single moment. The silence was overwhelming. No traffic, no voices, only the sound of wind and distant movement of nature reclaiming the space. It was both fascinating and deeply unsettling, because it was real, not a movie, not a story, but a place where people had lived, where life had once been normal until it suddenly wasn't. Back at the power plant, new efforts were underway. The original sarcophagus was aging, becoming unstable. A new structure was needed, something stronger, more reliable. This led to the construction of a massive new shelter, an enormous steel arch, designed to cover the entire reactor, to contain radiation for generations. It was one of the largest engineering projects of its kind, built over several years, then slowly moved into place, covering the old structure completely, reducing the risk of further release, a new layer of protection, but still not a permanent solution, because the problem beneath it remains. Even today, deep inside the reactor ruins, radioactive material still exists, still dangerous, still active. A reminder that some consequences do not simply disappear, they remain, long after the event itself, long after the world has moved on. And in Chernobyl, time continues to move differently, slow, quiet, unforgiving. As the years continued to pass, Chernobyl did not disappear from the world. Instead, it became something else, a place of study, a place of questions, a place where science tried to understand what had happened and what it meant for the future. Researchers from different countries came to study the effects of radiation. They examined soil samples, water, plants, animals, trying to measure how deeply the disaster had changed the environment. One of the biggest questions was simple. How long would the land remain dangerous? The answer was not comforting. Some radioactive elements decay quickly, days, weeks, months, but others remain for decades, even centuries. Elements like cesium and strontium spread across large areas, entering the soil, absorbed by plants, moving through the food chain, from grass and to animals to humans. This made contamination difficult to control. Even far from the reactor, traces of radiation could still be found. Another concern was how radiation affects living organisms over time. Not just immediate damage, but long-term changes. Scientists studied animals living in the exclusion zone. Wolves, birds, insects. Some populations appeared to recover, even thrive. But closer examination revealed differences. Higher mutation rates, changes in reproduction, unexpected patterns. Not always visible at first glance, but present. Subtle, complex. The human body responds differently. Radiation damages DNA, the blueprint of life. Sometimes the damage is repaired, sometimes it is not. When it is not, it can lead to disease, cancer, genetic disorders. But the process is unpredictable. Two people exposed to similar levels may have completely different outcomes. This made it difficult to fully understand the long-term risks. It also made it difficult to communicate them, because there were no simple answers. No guarantees, only probabilities. Over time, international organizations began to study Chernobyl more closely. Reports were written. Data was analyzed. Estimates were made. How many people were affected? How many would be affected in the future? Different studies produced different results. Some suggested thousands. Others suggested much higher numbers. The truth was complicated, because not all effects were immediate. Not all were visible, and not all could be directly linked. This uncertainty became part of the legacy. Not just what happened, but how difficult it was to fully measure it. Chernobyl also changed how people viewed nuclear energy. Before the disaster, it was often seen as a symbol of progress. A powerful technology, efficient, modern. After Chernobyl, that perception shifted. People became more cautious, more critical. Questions were asked. How safe is it? What are the risks? What happens if something goes wrong? These questions did not have simple answers, but they could no longer be ignored. Governments reviewed safety systems, improved reactor designs, strengthened regulations, trying to ensure that something like this would not happen again. But history had already shown that even with precautions, mistakes can happen. And when they do, the consequences can be far greater than expected. In schools and universities, Chernobyl became a case study, a lesson in engineering, in physics, in human error, in decision-making, because the disaster was not caused by a single mistake. It was a chain of events, design flaws, poor communication, risky decisions, delayed responses, each part contributing to the outcome, together creating a disaster. And this made it even more important to understand, because preventing future accidents means understanding how they happen. Not just technically, but humanly. How people think, how decisions are made under pressure, how systems fail, even decades later. Chernobyl continues to be studied, not just as a past event, but as an ongoing lesson. Because the story is not only about what happened in 1986, it is about what can happen when powerful systems are pushed beyond their limits, and when warnings are ignored, or misunderstood, or dismissed. The disaster may belong to the past, but its meaning still belongs to the present. As the years turned into decades, the story of Chernobyl did not fade. It changed. It evolved. It became something that people continued to live with. For many survivors, the disaster was not a single event. It was a lifetime, a constant presence, something that followed them wherever they went. Many former residents of Pripyat were relocated to new cities, new apartments, new environments, but something was always missing. Their homes had not just been buildings, they were places filled with memories, childhood, family, moments that could never be recreated. In their new lives, everything felt temporary, unfamiliar, as if they were living someone else's story. Some tried to rebuild, to adapt, to move forward. Others struggled, unable to let go of what they had lost. They would talk about Pripyat, about how it used to be, the streets, the parks, the simple routines of daily life. Things that seemed ordinary before now felt priceless. For older residents, the loss was even more difficult. Some of them had lived their entire lives in those communities, worked the land, built their homes with their own hands. When they were forced to leave, it felt like losing a part of themselves. Some chose to return, despite the risks, despite the warnings. They went back to contaminated villages, living in isolation, growing their own food, drinking from local water sources, accepting the danger, because for them, home mattered more than safety. They became known as self-settlers, living quietly, often unnoticed, in places the world had abandoned. For the liquidators, life after Chernobyl was different. Many of them were considered heroes, but recognition did not always come with support. Some received medical care, compensation, others did not. Some struggled with long-term health issues, conditions that affected their ability to work, to live normally. For many, the hardest part was uncertainty, not knowing how their exposure would affect them in the future, living with the possibility that something could appear at any time. Years later, without warning. This created a constant tension, a quiet fear, something always in the background. Families shared that burden, watching, waiting, hoping that nothing would happen, but never being completely sure. Children who grew up after the disaster grew up with its shadow. Stories passed down from parents, warnings, precautions, an awareness that something had changed, even if they had not experienced it directly. In schools, Chernobyl was not just history, it was personal. It was part of their identity. Meanwhile, scientists continued to study the long-term impact. One area of focus was genetics. Could radiation exposure affect future generations? Could it change DNA in a way that is passed on? Research produced mixed results. Some studies suggested possible effects, others found limited evidence. The complexity made it difficult to draw clear conclusions. But the question remained, and it continues to be studied even today. Another focus was mental health. The psychological impact of Chernobyl was significant, not just for those directly affected, but for entire populations. Fear of radiation became widespread. Even in areas with low exposure, people worried about invisible dangers, about food, water, health. This fear sometimes caused more stress than the radiation itself, because it was constant, uncertain, difficult to escape. The disaster had changed how people thought about safety, about trust, about the future. In the years that followed, new technologies were developed, better monitoring systems, improved safety protocols, more advanced reactor designs, all influenced by the lessons of Chernobyl. But despite these improvements, the memory of the disaster remained, a reminder that no system is perfect, that human error can always play a role, that unexpected conditions can always arise. Chernobyl also influenced culture. Books were written, films were made, stories were told, each trying to capture what had happened, what it meant. But no single story could fully explain it. Because Chernobyl was not just one thing, it was many things at once. A technological failure, a human tragedy, a political event, a scientific challenge, a psychological impact, all combined, all connected. Even today, when people hear the name, they think of danger, of radiation, of something invisible and uncontrollable. And yet, there is also something else. A sense of curiosity, a desire to understand, to see, to learn. Because Chernobyl is not just about fear, it is about consequences, about choices, about what happens when small decisions lead to large outcomes, and how those outcomes can affect generations. Long after the original event has passed, time continues to move forward. But in Chernobyl, the past is never far away. It remains present, in the land, in the stories, in the people. A constant reminder of a night that changed everything. Decades have passed since the explosion, but Chernobyl is not just a memory. It is still there, silent, standing in the same place where everything changed in a single night. Today, the exclusion zone is one of the most unusual places on Earth. A place where human life suddenly stopped, but nature did not. Without people, cities began to decay. Buildings slowly collapsed, roofs fell in, walls cracked, windows shattered. Rain entered apartments that once held families. Wind moved through empty rooms, and over time, nature took over. Grass grew through concrete, trees pushed through roads, forests expanded into streets that were once full of life. The city of Pripyat became something else, not just abandoned, but transformed. The Ferris wheel that never opened now stands as a symbol, rusting, silent, frozen in time. Schools remain filled with books, desks still arranged as they were decades ago. Gas masks scattered across floors, left behind during evacuation. Hospitals still contain equipment, beds, rooms where patients were once treated. Everything remains, but nothing functions. Time has stopped there, or at least it feels that way. But beyond the silence of the city, life has returned. Animals roam freely through the zone. Wolves hunt in forests. Deer move through open fields. Birds nest in abandoned buildings. With no humans to disturb them, wildlife has expanded. Some species have even increased in number. This created a strange paradox. An area unsafe for humans, becoming a refuge for animals. But this does not mean the environment is normal. Radiation is still present, still affecting life in ways that are not always visible. Scientists continue to study these changes, trying to understand how ecosystems adapt, how life continues under conditions that would normally be considered dangerous. Some animals appear healthy, others show signs of abnormal development. The long-term impact is still not fully understood, and perhaps never will be completely. Meanwhile, interest in Chernobyl has continued to grow. People from around the world want to see it, to experience it, to understand it. Guided tours have become more common. Visitors enter the zone under strict control, following specific routes, wearing monitoring devices, being told what they can and cannot do. They walk through Pripyat, stand in empty streets, look into abandoned homes. They take photos, record videos, try to capture the feeling of the place. But no image can fully show it. Because the atmosphere is something you feel, not just something you see. A mix of silence, history, and something difficult to describe. Something heavy, something that reminds you that this place is not just abandoned. It was left behind suddenly, without closure, without goodbye. Some visitors describe it as peaceful, others describe it as disturbing. Both are true, because Chernobyl is both, a place of quiet and a place of tragedy. Technology has also brought new ways to explore the zone. Drones, cameras, documentaries, virtual tours. People who may never visit in person can still see it, still experience parts of it, still learn from it, and with each new generation, the story continues to spread. But as time passes, there is also a risk that the disaster becomes distant, that it turns into just another historical event, something studied but not fully felt. And that is where the danger lies. Because Chernobyl is not just about the past, it is about responsibility, about awareness, about understanding what can happen when systems fail and when warnings are not taken seriously. Even today, the power plant site is not completely inactive. Workers still monitor the area, maintain the structures, ensure that radiation levels remain controlled. The massive steel shelter stands over the reactor, protecting the outside world from what remains inside. But beneath it, the core is still there, still dangerous, still a reminder that some problems cannot be undone. They can only be managed, contained, watched, and remembered. Chernobyl continues to exist in two worlds, one of silence and abandonment, and one of constant observation and control. A place where the past and present exist at the same time, where nature and disaster coexist, where life and danger are intertwined, and where every empty street, every broken window, every quiet building tells a story that has not ended and perhaps never truly will. Even as the years continue to pass, one question remains. Could something like Chernobyl happen again? At first, many believed the answer was no, that it was a unique event, a combination of specific mistakes, specific conditions, a product of its time. But the more scientists studied it, the more they realized something important. Chernobyl was not just about one reactor or one system. It was about how complex systems behave under pressure, how small decisions can combine into something much larger, something uncontrollable. Modern nuclear reactors are different, safer, better designed, with more advanced safety systems, automatic shutdown mechanisms, multiple layers of protection. But even with these improvements, risk still exists. Because no system is perfect, and no system is completely free from human influence. Human decisions, human judgment, human error. These factors can never be completely removed. And history has shown that unexpected situations can always arise. Chernobyl was not the only nuclear accident. There have been others. Different in scale, different in cause, but similar in one way. They remind us that powerful technologies require constant attention, constant responsibility, constant respect. Because when something goes wrong, the consequences are not limited to one place. They spread through air, through water, through time. The effects can last for generations, long after the original event has been forgotten. This creates a difficult balance. Nuclear energy provides power, efficient, low emissions, capable of supporting millions of people. But it also carries risk. A risk that cannot be ignored. A risk that must be managed carefully and constantly. Chernobyl forced the world to confront this reality, to understand that progress is not without cost, and that safety is not guaranteed. It must be maintained, protected, improved again and again, because once it is lost, the consequences can be irreversible. The disaster also revealed something deeper, not just about technology, but about people, about how information is handled, how decisions are made, how responsibility is shared. In the early hours of the accident, there were opportunities, moments where different choices could have changed the outcome, moments where action could have reduced the impact. But those moments passed because of hesitation, because of uncertainty, because of a belief that the situation was under control. This is something that extends beyond Chernobyl. It applies to many systems, many situations, where early warnings are ignored or misunderstood or underestimated. And by the time the truth becomes clear, it is too late. This is why Chernobyl is still studied, still remembered, still discussed, because it is not just a story about the past. It is a lesson for the present and for the future. Even today, new technologies are being developed, more advanced, more powerful, more complex. Artificial intelligence, energy systems, global infrastructure, all connected, all dependent on human decisions. And with that complexity comes responsibility. The responsibility to understand risks, to prepare for unexpected situations, to act quickly when something goes wrong, and to be honest about it. Because hiding a problem does not make it disappear. It only allows it to grow. Chernobyl showed the cost of delay, the cost of silence, the cost of assuming that everything is fine when it is not. And that lesson remains relevant, perhaps more than ever. Because the world today is more connected than it was in 1986. More dependent on complex systems, more vulnerable to large-scale consequences. A single event in one place can affect millions, across borders, across continents. This makes awareness even more important, understanding even more critical, because the next disaster may not look the same. It may come from a different source, a different system, a different kind of failure. But the underlying principles will be similar. Complexity, human decisions, unexpected outcomes. And the question is not just, can it happen again? The question is, are we prepared if it does? Chernobyl does not give us easy answers, but it gives us something else. A warning, a reminder, and a responsibility to learn, to remember, and to never assume that it cannot happen again. Even decades after the disaster, Chernobyl continues to reveal new layers of its impact. Not all consequences were immediate, not all were visible, and not all were understood at the time. Some of them took years to appear, others are still being studied today. In the early years after the explosion, much of the focus was on direct damage. Radiation exposure, evacuation, containment. But as time passed, attention shifted to something more complex. Long-term effects, not just on individuals, but on entire populations. Researchers began tracking health patterns across affected regions. Comparing data, analyzing trends, trying to identify connections. In some cases, the results were clear. Increased rates of certain cancers, particularly thyroid cancer in children. This became one of the strongest links to the disaster, because children were especially vulnerable. Their bodies absorbed radioactive iodine more easily, especially through contaminated milk. This created a chain reaction, from environment to food to human health. In other cases, the connection was less clear. Some illnesses increased, others did not show a consistent pattern. This led to debates, disagreements among scientists, different interpretations of the same data. Because radiation does not affect everyone in the same way, and its effects are not always immediate. They can take years, even decades, to fully develop. This made it difficult to measure the true scale of the disaster, not just in numbers, but in human lives. Meanwhile, another challenge began to emerge: how to communicate risk. How to explain something that cannot be seen, cannot be felt immediately, but can have serious consequences. For many people, radiation remained an abstract concept, difficult to understand, difficult to imagine. This created confusion and sometimes fear. In some areas, people avoided certain foods, even when they were safe. In others, people continued normal habits, even when caution was needed. The lack of clear, consistent information made the situation more complicated. Trust became an issue. not just in the Soviet Union, but in other countries as well. People questioned official statements, wondered if they were being told the full truth, and in some cases, they were not. This created a long-lasting impact, not just physical, but psychological. A sense that something invisible could not be fully controlled or fully understood. At the same time, the scientific community continued to learn. New methods of measuring radiation, better models for predicting its spread, more advanced techniques for studying its effects. All of these developments were influenced by Chernobyl because it provided real data on a scale that had never been seen before. This data became valuable, not just for understanding the past, but for preparing for the future. In the exclusion zone, long-term experiments were established, controlled studies, monitoring how ecosystems respond over time. Some areas were left untouched, others were observed closely. The goal was to understand recovery, if recovery was even possible. Over time, certain patterns emerged. Radiation levels decreased in some regions. Natural processes helped redistribute contaminants. But this did not mean the danger was gone. It simply changed, shifted, moved into different forms, different locations. Some elements remained in the soil, bound to particles. Others entered water systems or were absorbed by plants. This created a dynamic environment, one that continued to evolve even decades after the original event. Scientists also studied how radiation affects reproduction in animals, in insects, in plants, looking for changes across generations. Some species showed reduced fertility, others showed genetic mutations. But again, the results were not always consistent. Some populations adapted, others declined. This complexity made Chernobyl unique, not just as a disaster, but as a long-term experiment, an unintended one, but one that provided insights into how life responds to extreme conditions. Meanwhile, human stories continued to unfold. Former residents built new lives, new communities, but the connection to Chernobyl remained. Reunions were held, memories shared, stories passed down, so that what happened would not be forgotten. Some returned briefly to visit their old homes, walking through empty streets, standing in places that once felt familiar, but now felt distant, changed, as if belonging to another world. For many, this experience was emotional, a mix of nostalgia, loss, and acceptance. Because while the place still existed, their lives there did not. Time had moved forward, but not in the same way, not evenly, not completely. The disaster had created a break, a moment where everything changed, and nothing could return to what it was before. In the broader world, Chernobyl became a reference point, a way to measure risk, a way to compare other events, a symbol of what can happen when systems fail. It influenced policies, shaped discussions, changed perspectives. Even people who had never been near the site felt its impact, because it changed how they thought about safety, about energy, about trust, and about the future. As technology continues to advance, the relevance of Chernobyl remains, because the core lesson is not about a specific reactor or a specific time. It is about complexity, about responsibility, about understanding that powerful systems require careful management, and that mistakes, even small ones, can lead to outcomes far beyond what anyone expects. Chernobyl reminds us that not all consequences are immediate. Some unfold slowly, over years, over generations, sometimes quietly, sometimes invisibly, but always with impact. And even now, decades later, there are still questions, still studies, still efforts to understand, because the full story of Chernobyl has never truly ended. It continues to unfold in science, in memory, in the world we live in today, and in the choices we make for the future. Even today, long after the disaster, Chernobyl is not completely empty. There are still people who work there, not permanently in the traditional sense, but in shifts, engineers, technicians, security personnel, scientists. They travel into the exclusion zone for periods of time, days, weeks, sometimes longer. Then they leave again, returning to safer areas. This rotation system exists for one reason: to limit exposure, because even now, radiation is still present, still measurable, still dangerous in certain areas. For those who work there, this has become part of daily life, a routine unlike any other. Every entry into the zone begins with control, checkpoints, documents, radiation scanners, strict procedures. Nothing is casual, nothing is ignored, because even a small mistake can have consequences. Workers wear protective equipment when necessary. They carry devices that measure radiation in real time. If levels rise too high, they must leave immediately. No exceptions. Inside the zone, there are places that are relatively safe. Areas where radiation levels have decreased over time. But there are also hotspots. Locations where contamination remains extremely high. These areas are clearly marked, avoided, respected, because stepping into one unknowingly could result in significant exposure. Daily tasks vary. Some workers monitor the condition of the reactor structures, checking for damage, for changes, for anything that might indicate a new risk. Others maintain the massive steel shelter, ensuring that it continues to perform its function, containing what remains inside. Some are responsible for environmental monitoring, taking samples, recording data, tracking how radiation levels change over time. Each task is part of a larger system, a system designed to keep the situation under control, to prevent further contamination, to manage what cannot be removed. Life inside the zone follows strict rules: no unnecessary contact with surfaces, no sitting on the ground, no eating outside designated safe areas. Everything is controlled, because contamination can exist in small, unnoticed ways, on dust, on objects, on clothing. At the end of each shift, workers go through decontamination, careful checks, measurements, ensuring that nothing leaves the zone with them. Only after passing these checks can they return. This routine repeats again and again, day after day, year after year. For many workers, this environment becomes familiar, almost normal, but it is never truly safe and never truly forgotten. Outside the working areas, the zone continues to exist in its own unique state. Abandoned villages remain scattered across the landscape, some barely visible beneath vegetation, others still standing, slowly collapsing over time. In certain places, objects remain exactly where they were left. Furniture, clothing, personal belongings, all untouched, all carrying traces of the past. These places serve as reminders, not just of what happened, but of how suddenly everything changed. For researchers, the zone is a place of continuous study, a living laboratory, one that cannot be recreated anywhere else. They study how materials degrade under radiation, how ecosystems evolve, how long contamination persists. Each finding adds to a larger understanding, but also raises new questions. Because the system is complex, and not everything behaves as expected. In some areas, radiation has decreased faster than predicted. In others, it remains stubbornly present, bound to the environment in ways that are difficult to remove. This unpredictability makes long-term planning challenging. Decisions must be constantly reviewed, adjusted, reconsidered. Meanwhile, new generations are growing up with Chernobyl as history, something they learn about, read about, watch in documentaries. For them, it is not a direct experience, but its influence is still present. In education, in culture, in awareness. They learn about nuclear energy, about safety, about risk, and about what can happen when systems fail. For some, this knowledge inspires caution. For others, curiosity, a desire to understand more, to explore, to study, and in some cases, to visit. Chernobyl has become a destination, not in the traditional sense, but as a place of historical significance. Visitors come to see it with their own eyes, to stand in a place where time stopped, to understand the scale of what happened. They walk through Pripyat, past buildings that have not changed in decades. They see classrooms frozen in time, amusement parks that never opened, hospitals that still carry traces of emergency response. Everything tells a story, but not in words, in silence, in absence, in what is no longer there. For many visitors, the experience is difficult to describe. It is not just about what they see, but what they feel. A sense of emptiness, of interruption, of something unfinished. Because Chernobyl is not just abandoned, it was interrupted. Life did not end gradually, it stopped suddenly, and that suddenness remains visible. In every street, in every building, in every object left behind. At the same time, the presence of workers reminds us that the story is not over. That Chernobyl is not just a memory, it is an ongoing reality. Something that still requires attention, effort, responsibility. The reactor may be contained, the city may be empty, but the consequences remain. Managed, controlled, but not erased. And every day, people continue to work there, ensuring that what happened in 1986 does not create new disasters in the future. Because even now, the situation demands vigilance, care, and respect. For what still lies beneath the surface, for what cannot be seen, but must never be ignored. As time continues to move forward, Chernobyl remains, not just as a place, but as a presence. Something that exists in the background of human history. Quiet, unchanging, but never truly gone. For those who visit the exclusion zone today, the experience is often described in similar ways. At first, there is curiosity, a desire to see, to explore, to understand. But as they move deeper into the zone, something shifts. The silence becomes more noticeable. The absence of people becomes more real. There are no sounds of everyday life, no traffic, no conversations, no movement beyond nature itself. And in that silence, there is something else. A feeling that is difficult to explain. Not fear in the usual sense, but awareness. An awareness that this place is not empty by choice. It was left behind. Suddenly and completely. Every object tells a story. A pair of shoes left near a door, a book still open on a desk, a photograph on a wall. All signs of lives that were interrupted. Lives that did not have time to prepare, did not have time to say goodbye. And this is what makes Chernobyl different. It is not just abandoned, it is preserved in a moment. A moment that never fully passed. Even the air feels different to some visitors. Heavier, as if carrying something invisible. Because in a way, it is. Radiation cannot be seen, cannot be smelled, cannot be felt directly. But knowing that it is there changes perception. Every step becomes more deliberate, every surface more significant. Even without immediate danger, the idea of it remains. And that idea is powerful. It shapes how people experience the place. But beyond the physical environment, there is a deeper layer. Chernobyl represents a moment when control was lost. Not gradually, but suddenly. A moment when systems failed. When decisions had consequences far beyond expectation. And that moment still echoes. Not just in the zone, but in how people think about risk, about safety, about trust. Because Chernobyl showed that even advanced systems can fail. Even trained professionals can make mistakes. Even controlled environments can become unpredictable. And this creates a lasting impact, not just on policies or technology, but on perception, on how people understand the world around them. In a modern world filled with complex systems, this understanding becomes more important because complexity increases risk, and risk requires awareness, responsibility, preparedness. Chernobyl is often described as a warning, but it is more than that. It is a demonstration, a real example of what can happen. Not in theory, but in reality. It shows how quickly things can change, how normal situations can become dangerous, how assumptions can fail, and how the consequences can extend far beyond the original event. Even today, discussions about energy, about safety, about technology often return to Chernobyl because it provides a reference point, a way to understand potential outcomes, a way to measure risk. But it also raises difficult questions. Questions that do not always have clear answers. How safe is safe enough? How much risk is acceptable? Who is responsible when something goes wrong? And how should that responsibility be managed? These questions remain relevant, not just for nuclear energy, but for all complex systems, because the world today depends on them more than ever before, and that dependence creates both opportunity and vulnerability. Chernobyl exists at the intersection of these two ideas, progress and consequence. It reminds us that advancement is not without risk, and that managing that risk is an ongoing responsibility, not something that can be ignored or assumed to be handled. Because once control is lost, regaining it is not always possible. And even when it is, the consequences may remain. For years, for decades, for generations. As the world continues to change, as new technologies emerge, as systems become more interconnected, the lessons of Chernobyl remain, not as something distant, but as something relevant, something that applies, something that should be remembered. Because forgetting does not remove risk. It only increases it. And this is where the story begins to shift. From what happened to what it means. From the past to the future. Because Chernobyl is not just about a disaster. It is about understanding, responsibility, and the choices that define what happens next. As time moves further away from the night of the explosion, Chernobyl becomes quieter. Not because it is less important, but because it has settled into history. And yet, for those who understand it, it never truly fades. The buildings continue to decay, slowly, almost patiently. Walls crumble, roofs collapse. Nature continues its steady work, reclaiming everything that was once human. And in that process, the traces of the disaster begin to blend with the environment. Less obvious, but still present. The city of Pripyat no longer looks the way it did decades ago. It has changed, not restored, not rebuilt, but transformed. A place where time did not stop completely, but moved differently. More slowly, more quietly, as if the world itself had stepped back. In some areas, it is difficult to recognize what once stood there. Paths are covered, structures hidden, details lost. But in other places, the past remains visible. Clear, undeniable, a classroom, a hospital room, a broken window looking out over an empty street. Moments preserved in fragments, pieces of a story that never had a proper ending. For those who return, even briefly, the experience is never simple. There is recognition, but also distance. Familiar places that no longer feel familiar, memories that no longer match reality. It creates a sense of disconnection, as if the place exists, but the life that once filled it does not. And this is one of the most powerful aspects of Chernobyl. It is not just a site of disaster. It is a place where time was interrupted, where continuity was broken, where normal life stopped without warning. And that interruption still defines it, even decades later. The world outside has moved forward. Technology has advanced. Cities have grown. New generations have taken their place. But Chernobyl remains as it is. A contrast, a reminder, a place that did not follow the same path. This contrast makes it difficult to ignore, because it forces a comparison between what is and what could have been, between progress and consequence. It also raises a deeper awareness that stability is not permanent, that systems can fail, that control can be lost, not gradually, but suddenly. And when that happens, the effects can be lasting, far beyond the moment itself, far beyond the location. Chernobyl is often described in terms of damage, radiation, evacuation, loss, and all of that is true. But there is also something else, something less visible, something more difficult to measure. The impact on how people think, how they understand risk, how they view the systems that support their lives. Because after Chernobyl, those systems were no longer taken for granted. They were questioned, examined, challenged, and that shift in perception is part of the legacy, even for those who were not directly affected, even for those who were born years later. The story continues to influence how the world sees itself, how it approaches responsibility, how it prepares for uncertainty, and perhaps most importantly, how it remembers. Because memory plays a critical role, not just in honoring the past, but in shaping the future. Forgetting reduces awareness, it creates distance. And that distance can lead to repetition, to mistakes, to outcomes that could have been avoided. Chernobyl stands against that, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, persistently, as a reminder that some events should not be forgotten, that some lessons must remain present, even as time moves on, even as the world changes, even as attention shifts elsewhere. Because the meaning of Chernobyl is not limited to its history, it extends beyond it, into the present, into the decisions that are made every day, into the systems that continue to operate, into the future that is still being shaped. And as this story approaches its end, one thing becomes clear. Chernobyl is not just something that happened. It is something that continues to matter. And the final question is not only what it was, but what we choose to do with what we have learned. And now, after everything that has been told, after everything that has been seen, Chernobyl remains, not as a moment, not as a single event in history, but as something much larger, something that continues to exist long after the night of April 26, 1986. Because disasters like this do not simply end. They do not disappear when the fire is extinguished or when the headlines fade. They continue in different forms, in different ways, sometimes visible, sometimes not. Chernobyl exists in the land, in the soil that still holds traces of radiation, in the forests that grew over abandoned roads, in the buildings that continue to slowly fall apart. But it also exists in people, in memories, in stories, in the lives that were changed forever, and in the generations that came after, who carry its lessons, even if they never experienced it themselves. This is what makes Chernobyl different. It is not just a place you can point to on a map. It is not just something that happened in the past. It is something that continues to shape the present and influence the future. Because at its core, Chernobyl is not only about a reactor or an explosion. It is about consequence. It is about what happens when control is lost, when systems fail, when warnings are not fully understood or not taken seriously. It is about the cost of delay, the cost of silence, the cost of believing that everything is under control when it is not. And perhaps the most unsettling part is how ordinary it all began. A test. A routine procedure. Something that was not supposed to be dangerous. Something that had been done before. Nothing about it suggested that it would lead to one of the worst disasters in human history. And that is what makes it so important. Because it shows that catastrophic outcomes do not always begin with obvious danger. They can begin quietly, with small decisions, with assumptions, with moments that seem insignificant at the time, until they are not. Chernobyl reminds us that complexity carries risk, that powerful systems require constant attention, constant responsibility, and constant respect. Because once control is lost, the consequences are not easily contained, and even when they do not disappear. They remain, in ways that are not always visible, but always real. Even now, decades later, the reactor is still there, hidden beneath layers of steel and concrete, contained, but not gone. A silent presence, a reminder of what happened, and of what still exists. People continue to monitor it, to maintain it, to ensure that the past does not become the future. Because the responsibility did not end in 1986, it continues every day, in every decision, in every system that relies on human judgment, in every moment where risk is managed or ignored. And this is where the story becomes something more. Not just about Chernobyl, but about us. About how we think, how we act, how we respond to warning signs, how we handle responsibility. Because the lessons of Chernobyl are not limited to one place or one time. They apply everywhere, to every system, to every decision that carries risk. And the question is not only what happened back then, the question is what happens next. What we choose to do with what we have learned. Whether we remember or forget, whether we prepare or assume, whether we act or wait. Because the difference between safety and disaster is often not as large as we think. And sometimes it comes down to a single moment, a single decision, a single action. Chernobyl is a reminder of that. Not loud, not dramatic, but constant, quiet, unavoidable. And as long as it exists, so does its message. A message written not in words, but in consequence. And now, that message belongs to us, to understand, to remember, and to ensure that history does not repeat itself.